I think that kind of brings us to another portion of this conversation, something I wanted to talk a little bit about, which is about your recent appearance on the Joe Rogan Experience. We had you on, like Zach said, maybe a year or so ago to talk about your excellent book, Canceling Comedians While the World Burns. And you and Joe got into that a little bit as well on the JRE. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that experience, what you thought you got out of it, and also what you thought about the response to the interview, because for the most part, it seemed, people received it well. But to be honest, I did see some folks on the left kind of playing into some of the very tropes that you outlined in your book, Canceling Comedians While the World Burns, in response to seeing you have a civil, rational, reasonable discussion with someone who you probably disagree with on a fair amount of things, but also have a lot of common ground, which, again, shouldn't be something that we're scared of doing.
Yeah, definitely not. Yeah, it is amazing how people keep responding to that book by, like vividly demonstrating its central claims that like there's just been that's just kind of happened nonstop since actually before it came out. Since I think most people who got mad about it never read it. They just kind of reacted to the title and the cover. But yeah, so that is some of what I talked about with Joe Rogan, especially in kind of the last half of the interview. And it is some of what some people got upset about, although I actually think it's interesting and ties into what you're asking if you look at what some people got upset about. And I will say it, look, I mean, this is really, like, I feel gross and weird even like bringing this up as a like measure of anything, but like none of my tweets about this even got ratioed. So I think that
Ben's been watching the Vanguard.
I think that I think there's a silent majority here that was that was cool with it on the left. But
of course, and that was one of the things. Gavin and I were stoked when we found out that you were going on the Joe Rogan Experience, because too many lefties would pretend that they wouldn't want that.
Yeah, right. And I think I would have said, in fact, I actually did say kind of half jokingly, like maybe a few weeks before it happened, somebody said on Twitter, it's like, "Oh, Ben, when the inevitable invitation happens, are you gonna get high with him?" And I just responded like in this like very jokey way that like made it clear that I didn't think it was ever going to happen. But I also said like, yeah, but I also made it clear that like it's not an invitation I would have turned down, because I think it'd be stupid to turn it down. Like I don't know what the point of that is. I think I said, yeah, of course. I mean, if Joe Rogan ever invited me on to disagree with him about Bigfoot and agree about Medicare for all, I mean, I would of course not turn down his weed hospitality. And then since I made that joke, I was actually a little bit worried. Oh, shit, he could actually offer me weed on there, because on the one hand, that'd be an amazing story, but on the other hand, it's just not going to be a good conversation, if I do that. But turned out to be a non-concern. Drank some whiskey, didn't turn into a neocon, but did not get high on set. But yeah, so that the second half got into some stuff in the book. From the book, which is what he had originally invited me on to talk about. But the first half was mostly not about that, right? The first half was mostly about stuff like, Medicare for all and teachers unions and why the Postal Service is important, and Bernie Sanders' idea for postal banking, and why I think that economic inequality is bad in principle and bad for democracy, and how worker cooperatives work, and I would say why we would be better off with an economy that was dominated by them. But that's something I kind of started to get into. I said a little bit about it, then he kind of got distracted by Jeff Bezos' hot girlfriend, and we sort of went off in a different direction. But that was, but like started to get that in. And I think like, which I feel good about, especially because I've got to assume that most people who, he does 3-hour interviews. I'd have to assume that most people, probably, I know there's a hardcore of people who get through all 3 hours of every one. But
not all of them, but I did watch the entirety of yours.
Okay, well, I appreciate that. I would imagine you're probably in a minority there, because like that's a lot of time, right? So I'm happy that so much of the sort of core lefty policy stuff got got into the first 45 minutes. And I think that when you look at what people got mad about, right, like those people who did get mad about it, I think there were some people who did disagree with like some of the specific things I said, especially the second half. I think, when like some of the Antifa stuff that came up at the end, I mean, look, I'll own that, right? That's I don't think that street violence is something that's good. It's a good. I don't think that's a good door for us to push on. I don't think that would go well for the left. I don't like our chances. But other than that, and like maybe one or two other things, although I think that was the main one, like with a couple of exceptions, I don't think most people who got mad about it were actually mad about the content of anything I said. Like, because if you look at like some of the most sort of touchy, hot button stuff that came up in that interview, there was, there's a good 5 minutes of back and forth about trans sports participation, and my initial instinct was to kind of blow it off, so it's like I don't know why anybody's wasted any time thinking about fairness and Ivy League swim meets, but then then he wanted to push it. It's like no, but like what if you had a daughter who really trained really hard for this, blah blah blah, and I said, well, if I had a trans daughter, I'm sure I wouldn't want her to be entirely excluded. And I don't know exactly what the hormone requirements are for this stuff, et cetera, but there must be some reasonable solution. And then finally, I just kind of asked him what he thought the solution should be. And he said he didn't know. So it seemed like, all right, well, that sounds like about what there is to say about that. Right. And I think that, most people got mad about exchanges like that didn't actually disagree with anything I said, right? Because I mean, what did I say, right? I mean, I don't think you should exclude people. I similarly with the youth transition, discussion, as I said, I mean, again, I'm not going to pretend to have the medical expertise to say what the clinical, requirements should be, but I think if you're like forcing, a kid to, to go through, a puberty that doesn't align with who they are. I mean, that sounds like it could be incredibly traumatic. I wouldn't want to do it. And he seemed to agree. And even with the discussion about critical race theory, I mean, James Lindsay's been a guest on that show. But by the end of the couple minutes we're spending talking about critical race theory, he seemed to agree that the anti-CRT laws were an assault on free speech. So I think even in terms of those social issues, I think all this is a win. So I don't think it's really that people disagreed with what I said. I think it's they didn't like how I said it, that what they really wanted, people who got mad about it, was for me to like yell at him and like tell him that he's a bad person. And I didn't do that because one, I actually find him pretty likable. I think most people do. And two, strategically, I don't know what anybody would have gotten out of that. I mean, that just sounds like a horrible strategy, in terms of like actually reaching out to his audience. I think that, I mean, what I was trying to do with Joe Rogan is, more or less, I mean, obviously it's a very strange like example of it because it's kind of, surreal, right? I mean, like, spend 3 hours, drinking bourbon and talking about politics with the guy from Fear Factor. But but what I was trying to do more or less is model what I would hope everybody does, when like, if you're, leftist to socialist, and you're talking to like, your coworker, your cousin, your like brother-in-law who like maybe, doesn't wear a mask at the grocery store when you do, but, like has, but is actually pretty open to what you have to say on some core economic issues and is willing to at least hear you out on everything else, right? How do you talk to that guy? I mean, I hope you don't just yell at him because that would be incredibly counterproductive.
Oh, I totally agree, Ben, and I think you actually handled it really well. And I agree also that it's not necessarily that what people were upset about was things that you said. It was that they were upset about the fact that you didn't push back every time Joe Rogan said something you disagreed with, which, again, I think you're 100% correct, is the exact opposite way to go about that kind of a conversation. Because what's one of the things that people, just normie people, hate about lefties It's that they feel like they can't just have a normal conversation. They have to walk on eggshells. They can't just talk about what they want to talk about or express how they feel because they're worried that they're going to, trigger the lefty, and the lefty is going to, jump on every single thing they say. And, oh, actually, let me correct you. Actually, that's one of the tropes about the left. And I think you did a brilliant job of not playing into that whatsoever. I think the portions where you did push back, the times where you guys did have a, civil back and forth kind of little debate or argument, I think it came off very well. But you also know when to just sit back and, okay, I'm going to let that one go. I'm not going to jump in here and, try to jump down your throat for, saying something slightly incorrect or that I disagree with. And again, that's, a great face for the left, in my opinion.
Yeah. I mean, I think that a lot of it was interesting. I actually did see a couple people specifically on Twitter being like, oh, when he said, when he mentioned Jordan Peterson, like, why do you say something about that? I was like, well, because that wasn't really the point, right? I've written tons of stuff critical of Jordan Peterson, and I actually co-wrote an article with Matt McManus for Jacobin called "Why Jordan Peterson is Wrong About Everything," but like, just he mentions the guy's name in the course of making a point. Like, if you like bring the conversation to a halt while you argue about whether Jordan Peterson is a good guy or a bad guy, like that seems like a really horrible use of the time that you have on that platform. And I will say, look, this is, this is like more or less, I was treating this like, I was like out at a bar with a friend and we were, talking about politics for a couple hours. But even in more confrontational settings, like actual debates, like I did one of those last October, I think, with Charlie Kirk, and even there, right? Like, Charlie Kirk is going to say something every 10 seconds that I think is ridiculous. So you can't go after all of them, and you have to pick and choose and think about what your priorities are. And I think that's even more true in some ways in a setting like this, right? Where you're not trying to have a, confrontation and like call him out or whatever stupid bullshit people on Twitter would have wanted, right? But you're just sort of trying to basically, like, what's the mission in that context, right? Like if you're debating Charlie Kirk, the mission in that context is to try to show people in his audience that he's full of shit, right? That he claims to be some kind of populist now, but he doesn't even support raising the minimum wage, blah, 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 right? But talking to Joe Rogan, and I will say, I've had a very consistent view about Joe Rogan for years. I back in 2020, Michael Brooks and I co-wrote an article about Rogan's endorsement of Bernie for Jacobin. I actually just reread that recently to be like, okay, did I say anything here that's like different from, it's like, I don't think so, like, I think what I said there is like pretty consistent with what I said, in and since the conversation. And I think with somebody like Rogan, who is really politically, he's where a lot of persuadable Americans are at, right? And I'm not saying he's like every man or whatever. Like, obviously, he has his, like
$100 million.
Yeah. One, he has a couple $100 million more than most, people do. And two, he's got some very eccentric views. Everybody knows this, right? But like, that said, I think like broadly speaking, right? Like his sort of policy views, like what does he actually think, right? Like he thinks that, he's very sympathetic to stuff like Medicare for all and free college. He, supported Bernie. I don't want to exaggerate that point, but he said, he voted for him, right? He has, I think, some impulses that I disagree with on stuff like certain aspects of trans rights issues. Although even there, I will say, I think I got him to enthusiastically agree a couple times in the conversation that anti-discrimination laws should include gender identity. But like, I think he has some, impulses I disagree with about some of those issues. I think I think we sort of go down the line, right, for different things. I think that even though some of those things like Medicare for all, free college, he's very sympathetic to, when you get into sort of like bigger critiques of capitalism and just isn't okay to have a society that's quite this unequal. I think depending on how you go at it, right? Like, I think it might strike him differently, and he said very different things at very different times, but like what I'm describing is like would also apply to like tens of millions of people who, yeah.